Today we're going to be talking about the design phase of engraving using QCad. I've got a 2" by 6" rectangle made up of lines on the outside layer, so we intend to cut out this outside layer when we're done. We are going to place some circuit breakers on that. In order to do that, I'm going to place some construction lines 1 inch apart. Doesn't matter what layer they're on. We're going to be erasing them as we go. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines, and we're going to import a Clixon 7277. QCad uses the terminology import. AutoCAD and most other CADs call this inserting a block. It's the same thing, it's just different terminology. This particular circuit breaker is common in avionics use. We've got the case of the circuit breaker is behind the panel, indicated by a dashed line, and the nut gives us some indication how close we can get to this so we don't have a text that's actually underneath the nut. So the next thing to do is bring up the QCad text control or text entry box form, and let's talk about fonts. AvCam can use any true type font, or should I say it can read any true type font. That doesn't mean that every true type font is a good candidate for engraving. You should try to use a font that is fairly uniform in width throughout the different characters. We don't want little narrow parts and wide parts, because the wide parts may not fill in, the narrow parts may generate an error. So an Arial font is a good all-around font to use. In the selections, in the options that we've got bold, and that just fattens up the font a little bit. Not all fonts have a bold possibility. Same with italic. With QCad, it sets the italic flag. And the next thing, the important thing, is simple text. AvCam recognizes simple one-line text. AutoCAD calls it text. The opposite would be M-text or multi-line text. AvCam does not recognize M-text because of different implementations by different CAD manufacturers. Line spacing factor, you typically don't need to do much about. Angle, if you want to make a degree wheel or something like that, you can rotate text. Typically it's just at 0 degree angle. So we're going to do simple text. The next very important thing is alignment. The agreement between QCAD and AvCam is very close for most fonts. Your Arials and anything that is remotely like Arials. Some of your cursive fonts and fancy fonts, alignment and size may differ. The important thing is that you want to put a small amount of text centered above the point that you want, in this case, the circuit breakers. So you're going to want to use a bottom center. QCAD calls it base center. If you call it bottom center, that's because of the font itself. There's going to be a space on the bottom. So pretty much ignore these bottom center ones for QCAD. And they call it base center, middle center, or top center justification. So if there's any shift, any size difference, it's going to expand or contract about that center point and not affect the alignment on your screen. Now, there are cases, if you're just writing on the right side of something, maybe you want it lined up on the left side, so a left justification may be appropriate. But in this case, we're lining it up above the center line of these circuit breakers, so we want it center justified. Since the text that I'm going to put on is on the top, I'm going to have it bottom center justified. So now let's just use, for instance, COM1. You can use upper or lowercase. In most labeling and legends, I would suggest using uppercase characters. So we've got Arial, font, COM1, and we'll just place, oops, let me remove that a little bit. I moved a little bit too soon. This is one thing where QCad is finicky. You have to leave your mouse in place just a fraction of a second in order for it to grab that location. So I've got COM1. I can either go back to my dialog and change it. Here's another way to do it, where I put the same text on multiple places, but just go ahead and click that text, and then in properties come along and change it. So we got nav1, and if you just double click the text itself, you can change it there. So nav2, and let's do GPS. Let's talk about layers for engraving. There are very few mandatory layers. When I first put this text on, it was on the bezel layer. Well, we can't have it on the bezel layer because if we bring up the bezel layer in AvCam, it's going to want to cut all of these other entities as well. We don't want to cut those, so we need to have it on a separate layer. I made a layer called Engrave, and I just highlighted it and changed the layer name. So now they're all black. The color's irrelevant. It's just to help identify what's what. You can use any layer name you want. However, there are a couple of special layer names, and I've got Online and Hatch, and we'll cover those after a little bit. Right now, any layer name that is not named Online or Hatch will create a toolpath inside the outline of this text and try and fill that in. It will create a toolpath that's offset from that outline by half of the width of your cutter. So that may or may not cut out the complete inside of that letter, and it may or may not create an error. It all depends on the font. So let's save this and take a look at it in AvCam. Let's just save it. I've already got file number 1. Let's do alternate tab and go over to AvCam, load it, reload it actually in this case. And so now I've got the engrave layer highlighted. Let's just bring up the bezel layer so we can see how it aligns with our bezels. And so it looks like it's aligned and sized very nicely. Let's turn off the bezel layer. And remember that AvCam is going to try and cut anything that is visible on the screen. So now you can see the outline of this Arial font. Now we can go, first of all, this applies to both engrave and laser modes. The difference is just in how AvCam controls the tool. In this case, we're concerned about the engraver. Go to the cutting dialog, and I'm going to, first of all, let's try a tip width of 0.005. Any of these engravers have a tip width and an angle of the point. So the tip width is just the very, very tip, and the deeper you go, the wider this stroke is actually going to become. In this case, I've just got 5,000, so we can simulate that and see how it will actually do. So let's do the simulation, and now you can see it offset all of these lines by 2,500. So this red line here is 5 thousandths wide, and it has created a toolpath inside. So it's obvious that some of this letter is not going to be cut out. So the rule of thumb is to use a cutter size that is 10% of your letter height. I don't know if you recall, but we can look and see once what the letter height is, and it's 0.125. So following this rule of thumb, a 12.5 thousandths cutter width is what that would indicate. We may not have a 12.5 thousandths cutter, but let's say we've got a 10 thousandths cutter and we've got a 15 thousandths. Let's see how the 10 thousandths would work. The 10 thousandths with this particular font looks like it does a real nice job. It looks like on this M, just a little tiny bit would be left uncut. That's probably not a problem. Remember, as you go down in depth, the width is going to increase. So I suspect that would probably be okay. The 1, everything looks nice. In fact, look at the N. There's a little bit more that's left on that one. Again, this may or may not be a problem in the real cutout. So let's just try a 15 thousandths. And so now it's all cut out, but I'm looking at this 1. Now we've got a problem that comes into play because we've got too large of a cutter. So now we can see this M. You couldn't see it when it was full size, not blown up, but it's actually going outside the line in many cases, and a fairly large error there. So the font selection is a balance between stroke size and the cutter. Let's see once what happens with like a 30 thousandths or something like that, or something that's really oversized. Think of it as trying to sign your signature on a check with a large magic marker. It's just not appropriate. You have to balance the tool to the font, but we'll get back to the CAD part of this in a little bit. But the idea is to find a font and layer selection that is going to work best in our situation. Let's simulate that. So now we've got real obvious errors all over the place using a too large of a cutter. So the 1 doesn't, it just basically bails out and causes all kinds of problems. And remember, this is the tool path. Let's go back to our 10 thousandths, and that probably looks the nicest. Going alternate tab back over to the CAD, let's look at another way of doing this. We used a Arial font in this case, and let's just change the font for all of these to a different font called Legend. Legend is distributed with AvCam, should be installed on every computer that has AvCam on it. Now, this font is, for all intents and purposes, a single stroke, although it has the basic sizing, width and height of a Arial font, but it's very, very narrow. So if we zoom into that, what CAD does is it puts pixels in between. We don't have pixels to work with. We have a physical cutter, not pixels. So we have to work with the outline of this font. So let's save this just on the engrave layer and reload it. And so now it looks fine, but let's simulate it again with our 10 thousandths cutter. And you can see all kinds of bad errors. Again, this is just because of cutter size relative to the size of the font, or the width of the font, the stroke size of the font. So what do we do? This brings up another layer which is online. Let's just change the layer of all these text now to the online layer. The online layer, save it here, And now it goes away because we had the engrave layer up before. Let's just change it to online. And so now we see it. Let's just zoom into this and we can see it is here's the outline, and it's very, very, very narrow. So we're only looking at about 1/1000th of an inch or so between these two lines. But what the online does for us is it forces AvCam to cut right down the line, whatever that line may be, and disregard making a toolpath to try and fill in the inside. So let's see what happens with this. I'm going to hit S for simulate, and it looks really nice. It's just no overshoots. Everything is just perfect. So again, we've got a 10,000ths cutter. Let's see what a 15,000ths cutter looks like. And again, it's a little bit fatter, and it increases our stroke, but there's no big errors. And we can keep on increasing this. Let's go to a 30,000ths cutter, and still it looks pretty good, but obviously when you go too large, it's just going to start running into each other. Let's go to a 60,000ths cutter, and obviously that's just too wide. Again, just think of your using a magic marker to sign your checks with. So let's just use a 10,000ths cutter, and that works just fine. So why would we not want to use the legend font all the time? Well, it is so narrow in CAD that if you print that, it's not even going to print on most of your printers. It's just going to be blank, or maybe just some little hints of lines here and there, because it is so small, so narrow. The same thing goes for line sizes of, say for instance, this line on the outside. If we had a line weight that was 0, this probably would not print on a printer. So if you have to print it out on a PDF or a printer, you probably need a different font, which is not that hard to do just for printing. You could just change that to an Arial font for printing and change it back to Legend for cutting. But anyhow, that is your online layer. So consider using the Legend font on the online layer for most of your normal legends. So say for instance we have an N number that we want to be completely filled in on your panel. So let's go to our text input and put an N number, and let's make this 0.375 tall, simple text, and hit OK. I'm just going to plop this on the top of this line just for demonstration. Let's save this. Now this is on the online layer. Nope, it's on the engrave layer right now. Let's put this on the online layer. Save it. Reload. So there's our N829 Lima Bravo. Let's simulate. And so it just cuts the outline. Now that may be fine, depends on what your customer or you want. A Times New Roman font on the online looks actually pretty nice. Let's just change that real quick here. So let's go to font, and let's just put a Times New Roman. So you can use a fancy font if you're just going online, because AvCam is just going to track down the outline. It won't generate any errors. So that may look very nice just for an N number. But let's say, for instance, you want that completely filled in. Let's go back to our Arial here. And we're going to talk about well, let's just see what happens by changing the layer to a hatch. And it's possible that every font may not do a hatch correctly. But what the hatch layer tells AvCam to do is to create a series of horizontal lines that completely fill everything in. So let's bring up our hatch layer and simulate and see what happens. In this case, it did a nice job and filled everything in with our 10,000ths cutter. So with a 3/8 inch size letter, there's no features in there that are small enough that would create an error. If we tried to use hatch on something like the legend font, again, it is creating toolpaths inside that may create an error. So you have to look at the font, simulate it just with the correct cutter size to see if it's going to be appropriate for what you want to accomplish. So what you're looking at here is all of the red area is filled in with toolpath. Now, this is going to take a while to cut because during cutting, the green lines is where the engraver lifts up, goes to the next part, goes down, lifts up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, all the way back, forth. So it's going to take quite a while to cut this because of all of the mechanical movement that has to take place. So the main layers that we're concerned about is engrave, which is up to your discretion as far as naming, but the other special layers are hatch and online. In this segment, we're going to talk about some fancy text. So say, for instance, we've got this Algerian. It's got lots of little squiggles in it. Let's take a look at it. We've got test for text. We've got simple text. We've got base center justification. Let's place it. And it looks real nice. So let's save it and see what AvCam does with it. We're just on the online layer here. So let's go to AvCam, load it, and we're on the online layer. Let's simulate it, and AvCam will trace down the outline of it, okay, but even at 5,000ths cutter tip, it really doesn't achieve what we would like to do. And I can guarantee you that if we put it on the engrave layer, it's not going to work. So let's just try it and see what happens. So now we're trying to fill it, and we've got some dramatic errors in there, and it's just simply not going to work. It's just too small, too complex in order for it to work. This could possibly work if it was larger. We can try it. Right now this is 1/8 of an inch. Let's try it at 1/2 an inch. It's a possibility that it might work. So at 1/2 an inch, it actually looks pretty decent with 5,000ths cutter. So let's go to a 10,000ths. 101. Simulate that. And even 10,000, there's some errors here. They may or may not be objectionable. But in any case, most of your fancy fonts, you're going to have to stick with the online layer and just cut it on the outside. There's not much we can do about properly filling in the inside. So the next subject is M-text. Say, for instance, you got this placard that you want to make multiple lines on. Let's just go back to our Arial font, 1/8 inch high. Let's uncheck simple text. So what we're going to do, we're going to compose it in the text dialog and then explode it later. So line 1, line 2, line 3, and just for grins, let's do a left-hand justification on this placard. So now you can see that our M text is snapped to the lower left-hand corner. Let's save it. Load it in AvCam. loaded in AvCam. Nothing happens. Why is that? Okay, let's take a look at our settings. Look at text styles. And we've got suppress mText warning checked. Okay, so let's take that out, and now let's see what happens. We get a message that says mText not supported. We either get a message or it's just not shown at all if it's mText. So what happens with our placard? Well, that's really pretty simple. You can just go in here and explode it. If you go over here in properties, you see it says simple no. So you would think that I could just change that to simple yes and it would be hunky-dory, and that's not the case. So we have to leave it as a simple no, but then explode it, and now we've got 3 individual lines of text, each with their own handle. And let's save this. Bring it back into we're on the online layer. We should change this to engrave layer. There we go. Change it to the engrave layer so it fills in the inside. Our cutter tip width is 10 thousandths. Remember, the cutter should be about 10% of the letter height. We got 1/8 inch high letters. Let's simulate. And so that looks pretty good. Might possibly leave out just a little bit on the ends. You're probably not going to notice it. So anyhow, that's mText. The next thing is vertical text. So say for instance you want the name vertical going someplace. Again, we'll just do it with starting with mText. And let's just type the word vertical. VERTICAL. On this one, I definitely want a center justification so that these letters stay aligned with the center lines. So now I've got vertical. And again, just like we did with the mText, because this is what it is, even though it's just 1 character per line, we're going to explode it. And now we've got all these individual lines. We're on the online layer. Let's change this to engrave layer. Save it. Load it, and there's our vertical text. So we simulate it. We see that it's all simulating properly. Thank you for watching.